Hi everyone, in today's video we are going to be looking at setting up a bioactive vivarium. For today's video we're going to be using one of the new Exo Terra Frogs Co Dart Frog Vivariums. This is the first time that we've had the pleasure of using one of these, so we're going to be learning a little bit along the way as well. The first step in setting up a bioactive vivarium is the drainage layer. This is crucial to stop the tank from getting waterlogged. These Frogs Co tanks have the added benefit of having an inbuilt drain in the base of them. We'll come back to that a little bit later on when we're talking about automated misting systems, but for now we'll go through it as if it didn't have a drain in the base, and we'll just carry on setting it up like any other bioactive vivarium. The drainage layer in bioactive vivariums is normally made up of some form of clay beads, so that way any excess water will freely drain through it. Some of our favourite ones to use are things like the Habitat Amazon drain, the Lucky Reptile Hydro drain, and then there's some new bits in the Frogs Co range such as Exo Terra's Bio drain, and there's also a Substrate in the new Frogs Co range which doubles up as either a drainage layer or can be used as substrate. In today's build we're going to be using the Habitat Amazon drain. Now with the Frogs Co tanks there's a couple of different ways that you can get into them. So there's either access through the front, or just for simplicity today I'm going to go through the top here. So what we want to do, we want to make sure that we get an even layer of between sort of 1 and 2 centimetres in this sort of size tank. That looks like plenty to get us going. The next step in our build is going to be putting some form of separator layer between our drainage and where the soil layer is going to go on top. So often this can either be some form of fleece like the Lucky Reptile Hydro fleece, or in today's build we're going to be using the Exo Terra Bio drain, which is more of a mesh than a fleece. So the Bio drain mesh simply goes in on top of where our drainage layer is, and all we're going to do, we're just going to make sure that that's separated out into the corners. The substrate layer in any bioactive tank is one of the most important sections. Now, a lot of the time people may make their own using things like coir, maybe some shredded moss, either from a dry form or from fresh. Mix that in with maybe some bark chip, or possibly even some shredded tree fern panels and some activated charcoal. There's loads of different recipes for making your own substrate that you can use, but for simplicity today we're going to use a couple of pre-done blends, some of my favourite ones to use. So what we've got the Arcadia Earth Mix, which is a great sort of soil base, especially for growing live plants, and then we've got some of the BioLife Forest, which is sort of a pre-done shredded mix of various wood chippings, activated charcoal and moss. These two we're going to blend together, and that's what we're going to use for our substrate in today's build. Okay. So we're just going to go ahead and blend these two substrates ready for use. Now we've got our substrate ready, we're just going to go ahead and add in a layer that's about 2 to 3 centimetres deep, and we'll just make sure that that's nicely distributed throughout the base of the tank. Now we've added our substrate layer in to begin with, we'll just smooth that out a little bit. We now just want to look at what really makes the tank bioactive is the fact that it's a whole living ecosystem, and in order to help that ecosystem we add in a few extra bits. So we've got some earthworms here to add in. These can be added in at this stage into the substrate directly, and then what we'll do is we've got some tropical wood lice and some springtails which we'll maybe add in a little bit later on in the build. The next step in the process is what I call hardscaping. So rather than that being your live plants, that's all of your other bits like any pieces of wood, seed pods, bits like that you're going to use. So some of the stuff which we might use some grapevine, bits of cork bark, Some of these cork tubes make a great addition because, especially if you've got some thin ones like this, you can then use them as planters as well, so that you can plant some smaller plants coming directly out of these tubes. That's always a nice effect. There's bits of Mapani wood as well. This is a great feature piece. Some of the other bits which we use, so we use various types of seed pods and then some dry leaves as well. So we do various different ones here in store from lots of different sources. So we've got beech, and then in the new Frogs Co range there is also the Exo Terra forest floor. So this is kind of like a mixture of coir, and then you get some dry leaves in that as well. So normally we'll do the wood and bits and pieces like that, maybe the seed pods now, and the leaves will save as just a finishing touch right at the end. Other hard furnishings that you need to remember to leave a bit of space for are things like a water bowl. There's these new ones in the Frogs Co range, these frog ponds. I'm probably going to use one of these today just because I've not had the chance to use one before. And then various other ones here. So it's entirely up to you, but just remember when you are scaping the tank that you do want to leave that space for the water bowl. You don't want to do it all and then at the end go, oh whoops, where am I going to put that? Other bits that some people like to use just for a little bit of fun, maybe some little ornaments or some skulls, some pots. One of the nice new bits in the Frogs Co range, this little half coconut. It's an artificial one, but where it's got a base on it, especially if you're intent on breeding dart frogs, often they'll use cocoa huts as a spawning site. So this is just kind of like a pre-done one that may be a nice addition if that's what your aim is. Now we're going to go ahead and start scaping the tank. One of the things which I always like to do is, rather than just having the tank with the substrate layer completely flat, I often like to bank it up. So I'll use bits like this piece of flat cork bark here, so that I can then raise the substrate layer behind it, so that it draws the eye from a lower area to a higher area, and it gives the perspective of depth within the tank.
Do like a speed.
So we're just going to add some other bits in here. And I'm going to use this nice piece that I found earlier. That's probably going to come in somewhere here. But what I'm going to do, I'm just going to add some more substrate into these raised areas first, just to bring that depth up a little bit. Now that we've got some of our basic hardscaping in, we'll just make sure that we've left space for some of the other key pieces. So we'll probably incorporate some form of a hide down here at the front. And that frog pond that we were looking at using. These are nice because they've got an extra area below that you can then just bury into the substrate so that it almost sits flush with it. So it really helps to blend that in. One of the other things that can be a good idea, especially when you've got these cork tubes, is if you just fill up the inside with some loosely packed soil, then especially if you're going to plant directly into this, perhaps having a plant in the end or coming through one of these cracks here, you'll just find that it gives a little bit more base for those plants to then grow into. The next crucial bit in building a bioactive vivarium obviously is the live plants themselves. Now there's loads that you can use. Here today I've just got a selection of various different ones which I often like to use, especially in some of my dart frog tanks. So to give things a little bit of sort of structural height, perhaps planting more towards the back, I've got some things like, so here's a nice Aglaonema or Chinese evergreen. These work well. They do grow to about 45 centimeters tall eventually, so some pruning may be required, but they're a good quick filler kind of plant. Likewise with things like Begonia maculata. So again, these will add a little bit of height. This is quite a small one at the moment, but again, planted towards the back of the tank, they'll certainly give that illusion of depth. Then we've got things like a small monstera. This one is the monkey leaf version, so it's not going to grow quite as large, and the leaf size stays a lot smaller. Other than crucial bits are going to be adding some form of ground cover. Creepers are particularly popular in amphibian tanks and dart frog tanks. Some of them, things like Ficus pumila, they're great, especially in sort of more starter kind of tanks. A lot of seasoned dart frog keepers may say, oh no, don't use this one because it will grow everywhere, it will take over. But especially if you're just starting with keeping dart frogs, it's a really good one because it will grow quite easily within the enclosure. Again, you've got things like some of the pileas as well. Lovely small leaves on these. They look great in most dart frog tanks. Other creepers, so things like Tradescantias. So this one here is this one is Fluminescens. It's just got a little bit more colour on its leaves, this variety. Other creepers, we've got things like a lot of the philodendrons. So this one is a lime philodendron micans, but lots of the other ones you may see are philodendron scandens or Brazil, or there's also a gorgeous sort of coppery red kind of colour philodendron micans as well. Other bits that people often like to use, various ferns. Some ferns are going to do better than others. This one here is an Ethereum. These tend to always do quite well in kind of dart frog style enclosures. Other bits for a splash of colour, Phytonias are also another popular one. This one, if it doesn't get adequate light, will often bolt, so you need to make sure that it's not planted in a shaded area or it's not crowded in by other plants within the environment. Other bits that you may wish to add, this one's a personal favourite of mine. This is Cissus amazonica, also known as Amazon vine. It does eventually grow massive, but certainly the leaf size to begin with is very small, quite petite, and it's an absolutely fantastic climber within bioactive enclosures. It's one that will readily grow. You can continually prune it back and it's not going to harm the plant, so you can just allow it to sort of to grow into different areas. You can trail it around. I'm not going to incorporate a whole plant today, but I might just take a few cuttings because it will strike very easily from those cuttings. Most synonymous with keeping dart frogs is bromeliads. People often think of them as where they would breed and they would spawn within bromeliads. That's certainly true of some species. Today I've got a selection of various nigellariums and neurogelias that I'm probably going to incorporate within this environment. These are great because they can be grown either in soil, or a lot of them will grow epiphytically, which means that if you take them and they've got these exposed roots like this, or you can take them out of a pot and wash them off, you can then just wrap a bit of live moss around this, and then if you use either a piece of cotton or perhaps a plant tie, you can tie them directly onto branches, and there's no need for it to be planted into soil, so long as you keep it damp around the moss and a little bit of water in the cup as well. So I've got a few different bromeliads that I'm probably going to incorporate into today's build. One thing that I like to do is before I start taking any of the plants out of the pots, I'll often leave them in the pots and try them in different locations for fit until I'm happy with them. Just so that once I plant them in position, I already have an idea as to how the tank's going to look. Now that we've decided where the plants are all going to be placed, it's time to actually start planting them. So first up we'll lead off with this fern. So this one will come out of the pot. We're going to place that exactly where we decided earlier that it was going to go. So we'll place that one in there. Then some of the other ones that we decided. So we were going to put this nigellarium planted directly into the end of our cork tube. So what I've done is I've partially filled that cork tube with extra soil. Now that I've got my bromeliad in position, what I'm probably going to do, I'm just going to take some loose moss and just fill round the edges of that, just so that it's got plenty of anchoring material there. So we'll just add in a little bit of extra live moss that we can just pack in around this here, just so that it's got a nice solid base to fix to. Once you've finished planting your tank, it's always a good idea to then thoroughly water in all of your plants, just to make sure that they get a chance to nicely settle in position. earlier on when we were setting up the initial substrate layer, I added in the earthworms, but I said that I'd come back to the other custodians later on. That's exactly what we're going to do now. So we're going to add in some springtails. So these are tiny, tiny little critters which are going to go around. They're going to help clear up any mould and any bits and pieces like that. They're really good at breaking down general detritus within the tank. So we'll add a few of those in. Then next up we've got various wood lice as well. The great thing with the springtails and these, the dwarf white wood lice, is that these will actually also provide an additional sort of food source for the dart frogs within the environment. So we'll add some more of these in, and then we'll just move on to just one of the slightly larger species as well of isopods. So here we're going to add in some of the tropical greys as well. So we'll add a few of these in. Perfect. Once we've got our plants and our custodians in situ, the next thing we're going to do, we're just going to add a layer of leaf litter onto the surrounding soil areas. Most dart frogs on the whole don't actually really like being on soil, so this way it just means that it's a far more natural kind of substrate, well, a more natural sort of base for it, for where they're actually going to be hopping around. So here we're adding in some beech leaves, and then we'll probably add in some mahogany leaves as well, just for a nice little blend. With our layer of leaf litter down, we'll now just add in a couple of little accent pieces in the form of just some dried seed pods. So we'll just pop a couple and we'll just sort of dot them around. And then we have that cocoa hut that we were going to add in to make sure that there was a nice little hiding area at the front. Now that we've pretty much finished with setting up the interior decoration of the tank, I'm just going to spray it so that I water it in thoroughly, ready for adding some occupants later. Now that we've got the interior of the tank mostly finished, what we're going to look at is automatic misting systems. So there's quite a few different ones on the market. Towards the top end you've got things like the Hardscaping Rainmaker Pro. These are capable of doing numerous enclosures, and then obviously you've also got the really well-known Mist King system as well. They're probably going to be a little bit of overkill though for doing just the one tank here. So slightly sort of more basic and far more user-friendly versions. We've got things like the Hardscaping Rainmaker. That's a good one for just doing sort of like one or maybe two tanks with. Or the one which we're actually going to use today is going to be the Exo Terra Monsoon Solo 2. These ones are actually designed specifically with this tank because there's some mounting points on the inside of the tank which will fit the nozzles for this misting system perfectly. So that's what we're going to go ahead and install today. So the reason why we've chosen to use the Monsoon Solo is because with these you can take off the suction cup, and then this little tiny bit here will now actually clip into the tank. There's a small port so that you can clip them on either side, and that will actually now hold the nozzle in position. And there's also a little groove along the top here that you can clip the tubing into nice and neatly, and then it will then come out through the back here as well. So now that we've got that installed, you can then program the timer on here to come on numerous times throughout a day and for various different durations of misting as well. So at the moment we've just got one nozzle, but there is actually a second nozzle attachment point on this side as well. So we're probably going to go ahead at a later stage and stick a second nozzle on the tank there, just so that we get better coverage from both sides. One of the things with the Frogs Co tank is that we don't need to be too concerned about over misting, because within this tank, where it had that drain built into the base, it means that there's still a piece of pipe here which has a tap attachment for it, so we can drain any excess water directly out of the base of the tank without it being too much of a concern. Now that we've finished with the interior of the tank and we've got the misting system installed, it's time to take a look at the sort of lighting that we're going to use on this enclosure now. So with the lid up, it's quite nice. I can show you that there's this pane of glass at the front on this Frogs Co tank, and then at the back there's also this mesh panel here, which is going to double up as ventilation and a place to position a UV light. So I'll go ahead and close that down. What we're going to look at now are some of our various different lighting options. So over this mesh panel at the back here, we're going to install one of the Arcadia Shade Dweller lights. So these are a great source of UV. Some people don't use UV with their dart frogs. I certainly do. I breed lots of different species and I've always found it to be beneficial. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to put one of these over the mesh panel at the back. And then at the front here, we've got a few different options for lighting. Most notably, we're going to want to make sure that we promote good plant growth. One of the ones which we use most of the time, it's also from Arcadia, that's their Jungle Dawn LED bar. These things are great and plug directly into the shade dwellers. But today we're probably actually going to look at using one of the Exo Terra Sky units, which has been designed and came out at the same time as the Frogs Co tanks. So this is what we're going to use to sit over the front. Some of the other options that we have though, there are various compact plant bulbs. So there's some here by Exo Terra, and then the Arcadia Jungle Dawn range. These are all a compact E27 fitting, so they'll fit into a normal screw fitting. There's also the Exo Terra Daylight LED spots as well, so these are sort of a focus point. For all of these, you're going to be looking at either some form of canopy or some form of dome, like the Arcadia ceramic lamp fittings or the new Exo Terra reptile domes. So these are some of our other options for lighting, but as I said, the two that we're going to go with today are going to be the Terra Sky unit and the Shade Dweller unit. So the two light units that we've gone with today, so we've got the Arcadia Shade Dweller here at the back over the mesh, and then we've got the new Terra Sky unit here over the front. So we'll go ahead and turn them on. That's going to be our UV. We'll just have that on probably for about 8 to 10 hours per day. And then with the Terra Sky unit, these are quite a nice programmable unit where you can program them to do dawn and dusk, and you can even have them doing things like sort of like a storm sort of effect where it'll give you like lightning and things like that. So something a little bit more fun to play around with anyway. You can also change the colour hue of the LEDs just to promote various different sort of plant growth. So it's a fully customizable unit. So that's what we're going to go with as far as our lighting options go on this tank here today. So as far as the tank goes, this is probably how we're going to keep it here in the shop, because the shop stays pretty warm all year round. One thing that may be worthwhile considering though is, especially in a home environment, your house probably isn't going to be quite as warm as a reptile shop year round. Therefore, you may need some form of just low-level supplementary heating for your dart frogs. Most dart frogs prefer temperatures in the low to mid-20s. They don't want high temperatures, but equally in the winter time, your household temperature probably isn't going to maintain quite enough for them. Some of the ways in which you can heat these tanks, either through the use of heat mats, either high power ones which you can stick to the outside of the tank, or some of the lower wattage ones which you can use underneath the tank. Alternative options, you can heat them using low wattage bulbs, so you're just going to need to use one of those dome fittings like we mentioned in the lighting section. And into that you can put either low wattage incandescent bulbs or low wattage halogens. Here's some of the ones which we've used on other tanks in the past, so things like the Arcadia solar basking floodlight or the Lucky Reptile halogen sun minis. These are quite a nice option for a small localized area. Whatever option you go with though, do always remember with any heat source you do need to use a thermostat just so that you can regulate that. So either something like these Haversat ones here, these are always a great one. All you would do is you would have the temperature sensing probe going back in through the additional cable grooves at the top of the tank, and you'd plug your heat source into these. Or if you wanted something a little bit more high tech, you could go with something like the Microclimate Evo, and these ones are programmable so that you can vary the temperature throughout the day and have it at different settings for day and night and things like that as well. So that's the end of today's build. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope it's made it a little bit easier for you to set up your own bioactive tanks. We were going to go ahead and put some frogs straight in this, but I think what we'll actually do is we'll give it a little bit of time for the tank to mature before we then actually add the frogs in themselves. We'll get a little bit of footage later once the tank's had a chance to settle and we've decided exactly which species we're going to go with. We might go with perhaps some of our store-bred Dendrobates azuras, which are the little tiny blue and black dart frogs. So hopefully there'll be some additional footage due to come once they actually go into the tank and then sort of start to investigate that. If you've got any further comments, don't forget to like and subscribe, and you can always leave us a message there, and hopefully one of our team will have a chance to get back to you in due time. Thanks for watching.